Koto katoa. Ko Hedwig Eisenbart, so Ingwa. My name is Hedwig Eisenbart. I'm originally from Germany, and now I'm a associate professor for psychology in Teheranga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington, and I'm interested in forensic psychology in the broadest sense, and how emotion and interactions between people play a role in the context of antisocial behavior.
Kia ora koto. My name is Corinne Seals, and I am a senior lecturer of applied linguistics here at Teheranga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington. Originally from the US, but I have lived here for a good long while now. And I have an interest in forensic linguistics, an area which I have trained in, studied in, and actively work in as a forensic linguist. So Hedwig and I have a very exciting double presentation for you today to talk about a shared mutual interest. All right, I'll take it for the start. So the first thing to launch us off, Hedwig and I will be speaking today about deception and about two takes on deception, one perspective from forensic linguistics and one from forensic psychology. So my area is in forensic linguistics, as I mentioned. So we'll take a jump start into this, looking at how we can uncover deception through a forensic linguistics approach. We'll begin with a case. In October 2009, 17-year-old Ashley Hall of the United Kingdom went missing. Her body was later found in a remote area near her home. Police discovered that she had been on her way to a date with a boy she'd been texting with and talking to on Facebook. His name was Peter. These are her last known text messages that we know for sure were written by her. You see there are some back and forth between Ashley and Peter, also between Ashley and Peter's dad, who entered the conversation at one point. We'll not spend too much time on this, but I'm happy to share these at any point in the future if anyone's keen. You can email me. What arose as a question, however, were these two texts that seemed to have come in around the time she died. So one of the questions that investigators had was, were these messages written by Ashley or were they written by someone else? I'm going to fast forward now to the actual answer. As you see, this was the question, the Q text, the questioned texts. Were they written by Ashley or by someone else? The finding was that Peter and his father were the same person. They were Peter Chapman, age 32, who is a sex offender with multiple convictions. Dr. John Olson, who is a very well-known forensic linguist in the United Kingdom, analyzed the text using forensic linguistics and was able to determine that those Q texts, the questioned ones, were sent by Peter Chapman using Ashley's phone in order to keep suspicion away. And Peter Chapman, when confronted with this evidence, did admit to Ashley's murder and was convicted in 2010 and sentenced to 35 years to life in prison. So forensic linguistics has a real life, it's able to be applied to real life and be quite helpful for that. One of the questions that I often get, though, is when you are given a text or a bit of speech or one of many, many things that can be analyzed through forensic linguistics, how do you know how to begin? In all cases, one of the things that I usually ask for is to find, if there's a question of authorship or speaker identity, I ask for items where the person is known that they did those, and then to be able to compare those to a document that is in question. So an example of this, where we can compare linguistic features across texts, is if we have documents with a known writer, which we call KDocs for known, then, for example, if in those documents, the person we know who wrote those documents always uses their, spelled T-H-E-R-E, for any instance that could be any of the grammatical theirs, such as T-H-E-I-R, T-H-E-Y apostrophe R-E, or T-H-E-R-E, and then we have a question document with an unknown writer, and that person always accurately uses those grammatical items throughout, If that was the only linguistic element that mattered, then we could surmise that they were likely different people. It was not the same person who wrote them. However, it's not that simple. There are many, many linguistic elements we consider both in speech and in text when doing an analysis. So some of the other elements that are considered are things like sociolinguistic variation, also analysis of the discourse. Both of those are very systematic procedures in linguistics that we can apply for the purposes of forensic linguistics. Sometimes we might linguistically answer the question, why does it sound different? And we'll look at those items, but we could also look at things like phonology and phonetics, so the sounds, and our words pronounced differently. Also, are different lexical items used, so the individual words. Is there variation in spelling? Also, one of my favorites is syntactic complexity. So how complex are the structures within sentences? So that's something that's really under the radar, that patterns in a very interesting, very specific way. And people have a very difficult time convincingly hiding who they are when you analyze things through syntactic complexity. And just a point of note, forensic linguistics is not the same as handwriting analysis. We don't do that. Sometimes I have people ask me to do that. It's not that. It's a scientific approach to analyzing how language is used, not handwriting. So discourse analysis is one of the key items we use. And for that, we're looking at form and function in discourse. So what was said, how was it said? What was the function of this? What was implied? Was it considered successful in the communicative event or not? So how did people respond? If it was, why? If it was not, why not? What sorts of clues are there in the discourse? So we pull it apart a bit like a puzzle. We also look at variation in style because we have options in what we say every day. Some of them happen very quickly and we don't even notice that we're drawing upon our most frequent usage. Other times we think about which word is better or how might I say this in a different way. Those are all choices we make and those choices matter. In forensic linguistics, that also helps us identify intent and also characteristics of the author of the text. To do this, we analyze all possible tokens of a linguistic feature, even when they don't occur. Could they have occurred? And if so, what does it mean that it could have occurred and doesn't? Lots of questions going around with this. We also use corpus linguistics. So we can look at things like collocations, so words that appear together, or as I mentioned before, syntactic structures. So some examples of this, using the internet, looking at the subject pronoun in past, such as I was and am, I am and was, looking at how common different usages are. So this came from the book Word Crime by John Olson, who I mentioned earlier. And this was a search he conducted. And at that time, you can see the different frequencies that are here. Now, if someone used the structure I was and am throughout, that's quite common. That's what the database shows us. So that's not something that would point to any particular individual by itself. However, something like she is and was is quite an uncommon structure to find. So that would be more likely to point to a particular individual who might use that frequently. That would be a notable feature linguistically. But how do we account for deception? So all of this is talking about finding an author and assuming that they're writing as themselves. But deception is the act of misleading another person intentionally through intentionally false statements or fraudulent actions. So someone is trying to intentionally hide themselves. So how do we peel that back? One of the things we do consider is that speakers tend to shift their styles towards their intended audience. So we need to be aware of who that assumed audience is. And speakers will change their style and register for that assumed audience. Now, what's interesting about that is that for fake authorship cases, the author will attempt to talk to the audience how they think the impersonated person would talk to that audience. So it's an assumption made of how they think that person would do it, and they're trying to replicate that. So that's where we get that things often pattern closely, but not exactly as how the actual person would do that. So that's one of the first signs for us is things are showing up very near, but not exact. We also know from lots of research that there are certain markers of deception. So for example, when people are being deceptive, they usually either provide fewer details or way too many details. They tend to make more negative statements. They tend to use more language that is uncertain, impersonal, evasive, and unclear. And they tend to use more distancing language. Now, distancing language looks kind of like this, these different things. So you might have distancing through quotation, where if you have a direct quote, such as someone saying, I remember him saying, I completely disagree with this decision. They're voicing that other person, which leads to greater distancing in discourse because they're ascribing all responsibility to someone else who's not there. Whereas indirect quotations, such as I remember him saying that he completely disagrees with this decision, is claiming some of the voicing of that idea, which leads to less distancing in the discourse, cognitively as well, when we look at how language patterns. Another distancing strategy is people tend to use passive language. So my laptop was stolen yesterday instead of so-and-so, someone stole my laptop yesterday. Also, people tend to use them more and other groups of people, so make them seem like another, such as those people always steal. There's also a greater use of the third person pronoun, such as then she went outside, but there's no mention of I saw her going outside. The focus is on the other person. Also within the first person, when that's used, me and my is much more distant than I. So it's that objectifying what you're saying instead of remaining as the subject. So these are all distancing features that we can look for within the discourse. Also, there are two additional major strategies that have been found to be used in deceptive writing in particular. One is called being cooperatively vague. So being more verbose, talking more about the immediate actions happening, the immediate future, and also using more ambiguous speech. Also, there's impersonal disassociation and depersonalization. So using very short clauses, a very low use of self-references, more use of the third person, and agency is attributed to someone else. So much less agency is ascribed to the self. Purposeful ambiguity was one of the things I mentioned, and that's another way, a high marker of deception. These are three different types of purposeful ambiguity. One is using words with multiple possible meanings, such as if someone asked, did you leave a message telling her that I already sent her the file? And someone says she didn't get it. Well, she didn't get the message, she didn't get the file, she didn't get what? So using words with multiple possible meanings. Also using an implied actor who's not actually stated. So if someone says, this text needs defining, okay, but who's meant to do that? They're not saying. Or if someone says everything possible has been done, okay, who did what? What was done? Also, there's the maxim of relevance in pragmatics, which is that you respond in a way that is directly relevant to what someone else has said. So purposefully ambiguous discourse will flout that maxim of relevance. They won't use it, such as, where are you keeping the files? I've already told you all I can. That's not an answer to the question. That's actually another statement, and it's implied I'm not answering your question, but directly, no answer has been given. All right, let's look at another case. So this is a case I worked on. Police contacted me about their concern around a potential abuse case. The stepfather was arrested after a young girl in primary school said he abused her. The stepfather was then released on bail. Police were given a handwritten letter after this that the girl's mother said was written by the girl. Police questioned the validity of the letter. And that's when I came in and I asked for known documents as well as the question documents. So I was given 5 known pieces of writing by the girl and the questioned letter. There were 2 areas I chose to focus on as this is a written case. One was lexical variation between and across texts, so differences in word choice and word usage. And another was syntactic complexity. How complex were the individual sentences? However, there was a quite unexpected challenge that arose. So this is one of the tables that we use when doing this sort of analysis. The first column are instances of the words in the question document. The second is instances of notable words or misspellings or things you wouldn't expect occurring in the first known document, and then you get this across the different known documents. Now, it's very, very rare that when you fill out the known document, none of those things are occurring in the question document. So that's an absence of comparative elements, but an absence does not mean that you can conclude it's not the same person. It means you have to take a different course of analysis because you can't base a conclusion on an absence of evidence. So instead, I look to syntactic complexity, which is how complex are the sentences that are being constructed. And in this case, we're looking at sentences. So specific spellings they're not relevant to the level of complexity in the sentences themselves. So I use the syntactic complexity analyzer, and there's information there for anyone who'd like to know more about it. And I looked at things such as the mean length of the sentence, the mean length of a T unit, which is a core grammatical clause, and all the things around it that are dependent on it, how many verb phrases there were per T unit, so number 2, and then also how complex the nominals are for the T unit, which means how many independent noun phrases can be found within that T unit. So I ran those, and for anyone who likes numbers, you might start to see that there's a very interesting pattern occurring. But for those who aren't as comfortable with numbers, here's a visual. So the dark blue on the right is the question document each time, whereas the other 3 colors are the known documents. Now, statistically, there was a significance in the difference between the Q docs and what was happening there versus all the K docs. So the K docs were patterning more or less the same with some variation, natural variation that we would expect, but the Q docs were happening more often, in particular for mean length of sentence and mean length of T unit. So what's particularly interesting, you say, okay, so what? So you've got this, we see there's a difference. What's that mean? Well, we then take it back to what we know about language that's been studied, and the way that the syntax complexity is being used in these K docs is the way that we expect from someone in primary school. However, the way it was being used in the Q docs is the syntactic sophistication found in secondary school and above. So while the handwriting looked the same, my conclusion that I was able to come to was that there were indicators that the girl had likely been led in what to write by someone who had an education of secondary school or higher. So the handwriting was likely hers. Like I said, we don't look at handwriting, but the words were very much influenced by someone else. So if you are interested in these types of topics, I can refer you to this chapter that I worked on with Natalie Schilling in this book, which actually goes into quite a number of other examples, looking at deception in speaking and writing using a forensic linguistics approach. Thank you very much. Kia ora koutou, and over to you.
That was super interesting.
Oh, cheers.
Very cool. So coming from here, it's a very interesting pathway to see how you actually use the language to figure out if basically somebody's intentions. Is that right? So we in this area that I'm working in think about deception and things that people do in the course of committing a crime, but also in the courtroom from an individual perspective. Again, you also talk about the individual, but we're talking about like what do they bring with them as a characteristic that they bring with them. So one of the things that has been quite interesting in the past, or one of the characteristics is psychopathic personality. And so I want to start out with also a case example. So imagine you're in the courtroom and you're hearing about this case. On April 22nd, 2014, Susan died from a debilitating and mysterious illness. Police determined her husband, John, had been slowly poisoning Susan while pretending to care and nurse her back to health while she had a very severe illness. 2 months prior to her death, John spoke to his wife about increasing the values of their life insurance policies. He subsequently raised each of their policies to be valued at $250,000 each. John attempted to collect the money on his policy only days after his wife's burial. This was the second marriage of John. He was first married with a wife he was divorced from only after 6 months after they got married. And in this case, that first wife discovered that John had a sexual relationship with a woman. Shortly after divorcing with his first wife, John met and moved in with Susan. They married 6 weeks later, and in his free time, John reported that he enjoyed going to the casino. And one friend stated that he was fun to be around because he's so carefree and spent money like it grew on trees. Prior to his arrest, John had been a manager at a local clothing store for approximately 1 year. He had previously worked on another location, but had to be transferred due to physical altercations with his boss. His boss had reprimanded him for consistently disregarding the company's policy on inappropriate language in the workplace. Although there was evidence that John provoked the physical fight, John claimed self-defense, and witnesses were unable to speak on details of the altercation. Instead of firing John and risking a potential civil lawsuit, the company transferred him to another location. During the trial, so while you're there, John insisted on taking the stand to testify in his own defense against the advice of his attorney. On the stand, John appeared confident, self-assured, stating that it is ridiculous for a man of his stature to plead for his life. John denied any participation in the crime and instead stated Susan was suicidal due to the pain associated with her illness. And he also spoke at length about how the events both his wife's death and the trial had interfered with his life. Reports from the local jail where he was before the trial started suggested John was well behaved while awaiting trial, with the exception of a single brief verbal altercation with a corrections officer, and he was described by guards as a rule follower and cooperative inmate. So now think a little bit. What do you think about this person, and how would you perceive such a person in the courtroom? Well, when we give such example descriptions to participants in studies, what they most often say is that this person is high on psychopathic personality. So what is psychopathy? Many people think first about examples in movies and in the literature, like Hannibal Lecter, who are highly psychopathic and commit serious crimes, oftentimes also very sadistic crimes. However, that's not necessarily a characteristic of it, but what people high on psychopathy are characterized by is impulsive antisociality and an unemotional dominant style. What do these things mean? So this impulsive antisociality is defined by risk-taking, being irresponsible, ignoring rules of the society and other rules, and harming others. And the other component of psychopathy is basically this unemotionality and being very dominant. And this is described as what people often say this is really the core of psychopathic personality, this low empathy, this low ability to feel with other people, very savvy on the social side, being able to manipulate others, basically getting off what they want from others very easily, and also pathological lying. There we go. Mm-hmm. Deception alarm. So this is what people think, that people high in psychopathy are probably very prone to do that. But are they really? So there are a couple of studies out there that actually looked into that, if people high on psychopathy lie more. And what is important to consider when we talk about this is that we don't see psychopathy as a a kind of like disease type of characteristic, which you either have or you have not. It's not you are a psychopath or you're not, but psychopathic personality traits are dimensional. And so people vary on that dimension and have more or less of those traits. So any of those results that I'm going to talk about are related to this idea that you can have a relationship between the higher somebody is or scores on those psychopathic traits. For example, for this variable X, the higher they are on this other variable X. So it's important to keep in mind that it's not about people that we compare people who are psychopaths with non-psychopaths, but we think about it, do higher levels of this trait relate to something? So in terms of lying, what actually has been found is that people who are high on psychopathy tend to exaggerate the reactivity of their homicides and being like more a reactive behavior rather than a proactive behavior. And they also tend to omit major details of their offenses. So that's something that goes along with these traits, as in trying to downplay certain aspects, but also being very savvy about that in which parts of them. Another thing that has been found is actually that people high on psychopathy tend to speak faster and do more blinking and more head movements while they're lying in comparison to other people who are lying. So again, important to look at what the comparison is. So they seem to show that also in their the way that they talk, to show some certain characteristics that seem to be related to the psychopathic traits. That's not necessarily yet tell us more about the success of the lying. And they also have been found to, when they can choose to lie, to really more often choose to lie. So if it's like open to them, they would rather go for lying than telling the truth. And it's actually also quite interesting, this pathological lying criterion of psychopathy is not necessarily just like lying for the purpose of getting something, which would make a lot of sense for some people, but also lying just for the purpose of lying. So just seeing, can I convince somebody of something that has not happened, and how good am I in doing so? So this is quite interesting, that it's also this kind of playing with the other person in the social context. And you can imagine how that can also play a role in the courtroom. And what is also quite interesting, so how do they potentially do that? What has been found is that if the participants are asked to show a deceptive facial expression, so to show a facial expression that they're actually is not related to how they currently feel, the leakage of their true emotion, how long that leaks through, is shorter for them. So they actually don't show that much of a leakage. So they are very good in actually pretending a facial expression in comparison to those lower on psychopathy. So yes, they seem to do that more often, not only in this description or as kind of a symptom of psychopathy, but now, of course, the big question is, are they actually better in doing that? Well, there are mixed findings. So that's definitely not a clear picture. There are some findings that show that these psychopathic traits contribute to be a good liar, to be convincing, to convince people of things that have not happened. But there are also other findings that did not replicate that. So it's really not a clear picture if they're really better at it, even if they try to use that. Also, what we can do to actually try to understand better what is happening while somebody is lying, and if that is related to certain personality traits, but also to the way that they deal with the current situation. Some studies have looked, and it's very few studies only, unfortunately, so far, what is going on in the brain while people are lying. So, and the unfortunate thing is, so far, the picture is really diverse. So some studies found higher brain activity in areas that are linked to emotional processing. So something that goes on when you actually probably feel bad about telling a lie, not being truthful. And other studies found higher activities. A higher and lower activity is not consistent between the studies. And so I think that probably needs just more work in this area, very small sample sizes. But this could be an avenue in the future to figure out what is that's going on that makes it probably easier for them to do it, and what does it, how does it then relate to the behavior? And as another addition, although psychopathy is related to malingering, for example, as well, so there is a correlation, it is not a good predictor. So coming back to this idea about sometimes two variables can be correlated, so they co-occur. That does not necessarily mean that from knowing one tells you something about the other one. So for example, knowing that somebody's high in psychopathy does not give you a guarantee that this person is going to be malingering or lying consistently. So that's important to keep in mind. Correlations are not always good predictors. So now that we know people high in psychopathy do lie more, but they're not necessarily better with it. The question is, how do they present themselves in the courtroom? So, and coming back to that example I mentioned at the beginning, so how do you see John when he's there on trial and defending himself? So this is a very interesting area of research that ties into this question of how people make decisions, so especially juries make decisions. What we do in this context, we give these kind of scenarios, one that I just read out to you, to people, and we tell them, imagine you are in the jury, imagine you're at the courtroom, and that you have to make a decision. And we give them these scripts, short descriptions of a case, and then we ask them, and that's the research in this field is predominantly done in the US, where the question is then oftentimes, do you consider a death sentence or a prison sentence for this person? And then we can evaluate based on these descriptions that have been given, what is the response? And we can also ask, how certain are you, and how responsible do you think this person is, and how treatable do you think this person is? And then, as you can imagine, we can then vary this description. So the one that I just read out to you was one that actually had cues in it for somebody being high on psychopathy. You can vary that description, keep all the text the same, all the words the same almost, and it just vary tiny bits and pieces where it's about characteristics that refer to psychopathic personality. And then see how this variation in these scripts have an impact or vary the way that people evaluate it and come to a conclusion about it. So what do we find when we investigate how do these descriptions varying on psychopathic traits in the defendant influence the decisions? First of all, as you know, public perception of psychopaths is to be intelligent, cunning, dangerous, and intrinsically evil. So basically that applies to the jury members as well. And so what we find is that there's a higher support for death penalty and less positive evaluation of potential positive treatment effects for people that are described as highly psychopathic. And interestingly, this is not even mentioning the word psychopathy at all. So this is also holds if this is just a description as one that I just read out to you. The interesting other question then was in a recent study that we're just writing up at the moment. Does gender matter? Because gender tends to matter in the courtroom in terms of how people perceive a defendant and how they think about this defendant to be treatable as well. And so we wanted to see in a variation of this, varying the gender of the defendant by simply swapping the name. And also varying the characteristic, the psychopathic characteristics from being more this violent male type of stereotyped male psychopathic characteristic description to a more female one, where it's more like malingering and more indirect violent or indirect antisocial behavior. Very stereotyped. Interestingly, neither of the two things mattered. So here we not the defendant gender did not matter, and not the characteristics of those psychopathic traits. No matter what, those who were described as more psychopathic in this type of description were referred to as they should have received death penalty more often, and would be less able to, or would be less effective in treating them. So now the big question is, of course, what are the mechanisms? How and why does that? What is the relationship between psychopathy and malingering and lying and being deceptive, and especially in the courtroom where it's like a highly stressful environment? So one can think of the stress resistance as part of the characteristics could be one of them, which is actually linked to another characteristic of psychopathy. So people high on psychopathy are low on fear. They just don't feel the same stage fright, and they don't feel the same type of fear of punishment, also very relevant to the courtroom. So that might be some sort of mechanism that is underlying this. And here's more research to be done, definitely. So what can we conclude? Psychopathy is related to more lying, but not to better lying so far. Psychopathic defendants are seen as more punishable and less treatable. The only question, or many questions are still open, but one question would be, should we actually assess psychopathic traits for the courtroom? Should we let people know that this defendant is high on psychopathy, or should we rather not? And this is something, food for thought for yourself. And Nui, thank you. And I think we're going to move into the Patai section, questions. And
it's really interesting. Thanks.
Okay. So I think we're going to wait until some questions come in, and until that starts, maybe you can, I would be interested to hear, how do you actually ever think about characteristics of the individuals, like other characteristics while you're doing this?
No, I don't. I actually specifically ask to not be told anything about them, because it's very important that I separate the linguistic analysis from a psychological analysis, because I'm not a psychologist. So I can't look at those aspects. And I have been asked by attorneys in the courtroom to comment on that, but no, I cannot, because that's not my area of specialty. So sometimes people offer to tell me things about the suspects, and I ask not to be told.
So how much do you actually then know about the case in general?
I know what the proceedings have been so far up till that point. I also ask to be given any evidence that has anything to do with language that's under consideration and that's considered relevant at the time. And I ask for whoever I'm working with to, whichever agency or whichever attorney, to give me very specific questions of what they want to know. And then I'll ask them, do you actually mean this? Or, is it this you're looking at, until we get to the language related issues. And then that's where I can give an assessment on the language. So it's always a piece of the puzzle, but it can never be the full answer to the puzzle.
It's also interesting because you try to not being influenced by all sorts of characteristics of the case and the person.
Yeah, exactly. And there is a motive language that comes out, of course, but that's tied into the language, so that can be analyzed from a linguistic perspective. But anything about the past history of the person or any of that, I don't want to know that, because that would influence. And no, don't want that. So how much do you look at language?
Good question. Yeah, I actually in this type of research, it's present in all of these pieces of research. It's present because we use language, but not in that way. So it's quite interesting. So going back to court testimony, more from the psychology type of view, we do take into account the language, how people use the language. So, but more like in this indirect way. So it's much more about, it's not so concrete and not so detailed as you would do in a discourse analysis, but we would, for example, the way that somebody interacts with us or with me as an examiner or so, the language that they use, if they try in an interview, for example, when we do an assessment interview, the way they talk with us. So that's definitely something to consider. And if there's people high on psychopathy tend to have a certain way of interacting and also use of language, and so that definitely comes in.
Definitely, I could see that.
Okay.
So one question, what happens in the courtroom if the defendant refuses to take the stand and therefore there are no linguistic clues?
Oh.
So I suppose when I analyze things, it's usually from a forensic linguistic perspective, it's what happens before the courtroom. So it's an analysis that takes place as part of the investigation. Sometimes I am called in by if there was a case and something was questionable that happened in the courtroom and now it's being appealed. Sometimes I'll be called in at that point, and I will be asked to review some aspect of the testimony, but that can be from anyone. So it's whatever was at issue. So it's not necessarily what the defendant said. It can be what any of the witnesses said. It can be what the plaintiff has said. It can be what the attorney said and how they went about what they did. So it's usually done, well, it's always done after the fact. So I don't do it live because I need that time to sit with the data and do the full analysis and go into depth. So whether it's after the fact of the crime's been committed and now the investigation is ongoing, or if it's after the trial and now there's an appeal process.
Yeah. So you basically work off the transcript then?
Yeah, off the transcript or recording. So sometimes I'm given a recording and I then transcribe it, and I have the recording and the transcript both to work with. Because linguistic transcript is also quite different from courtroom transcript. It's much more detailed. Yeah.
What percentage of serious crime is perpetrated by persons high in psychopathic traits in general, as opposed to low scoring in psychopathic traits? That's a very good question. There are not really good numbers on that, but what people, it's quite interesting because there's in the literature, there is this number that people come up with that is not really easy to trace down, but because we don't have a full examination of psychopathic traits of people who have committed crime, so that we would need basically to be able to answer the question right. But what is actually definitely true is that the percentage of crime that is committed by people higher in psychopathy is higher than you would expect. So it's also there's not only the serious crime, but it's also more iterative. So people who are high in psychopathy commit crimes more often, so they also come back more often, and for that reason, there's actually the bulk of the crimes are actually committed more by people higher on psychopathy rather than lower on psychopathy.
And here's another question for you. Do you retrospectively analyze whether someone is demonstrating some psychopathic traits, or does it take place during a proceeding? And what other factors do you look at, if any?
Retrospective analysis. So we don't think that psychopathic traits change that quickly. So we would always think that if I assess them today, they will have similar traits tomorrow and in a week's time. They change over the life course, but so it can be done retrospectively, if you want to say so. However, depends on where you are and how that assessment is asked for. So sometimes it's during a trial that they come out and say, like, we want this assessment, and then you would do that assessment, but not in the courtroom. So you would need, for an assessment for psychopathic traits, you need file records. You need to go and talk. Ideally, you talk with the person and have a couple of sessions with them, and then you do an expert-based rating that you need to be trained for, and you can do that at any time. And if you have like such an assessment, you probably don't need to do another one a year later because they're kind of stable.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Can I ask you that question that somebody posted? Speaking in the third person or in language that doesn't apportion blame in the active voice is the writing style that lawyers adopt and are taught. is that something that you take into consideration?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, that's why there are a lot of these features that individually can be assigned to different groups or different genres, different writing or speaking styles. That's why we take the whole bank of these things together to analyze and see if there's a patterning happening across a larger group of features. If it was, genre specific such as that, and we're not finding the other deceptive markers, well, that actually can tell us that might be someone who had some sort of training, either self-training or formal training in legalese as well. So it's still a clue, a language clue. But when it comes to deception, yeah, we would take the whole bank of possible features to see how many are being ticked off by that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Related to that, I wondered when you showed that plot with how much these features were of the writing style from the pieces of that girl, and then in comparison to that document in question, and you were referring to that the features that in the other pieces of writing were more similar to like a school level. How do you know that? Are there some sort of norms out there?
So there are heaps of studies that have already happened looking at in language learning and education, and looking at development of language. So we know things about the syntactic complexity, the type of complex vocabulary that people can use, that they tend to use. So there's a common patterning in the way that people at different ages and at different educational levels, assuming that they've continued in their education, otherwise it's just at that educational level, whatever their age might be. But it patterns in a certain way. And yes, there's give and take, but not so drastically that you would get someone suddenly jumping. One day they're writing all like a primary school student and always writing that way. And then, the next week they're writing like a secondary school. That doesn't happen unless they're led or, encouraged to include certain words and phrases. And it has to do with also the complexity of the sentences themselves, how many embedded phrases you have within the sentence. So the younger people are, the younger their educational level is, they tend to use more direct, less embedded parts in their sentences. The more educated someone is, their sentence structure gets much more complex and they have many more embedded pieces.
And also something related to that, could you tell from the writing style, and again, are there norms or something that you can compare it to, from which area, from a country, or from which part of the world somebody's coming from, or you mentioned the level of education, what type exactly of education? So for example, what type of schooling that would have been, or is that possible?
Well, that is one of the things I ask, if the people approaching me for an analysis, if they can tell me if this person, the language they're operating in, is that their first language, is it an additional language, what's the region, is that the region they're from, or have they moved? That sort of information is highly relevant, because then that tells me if I need to take into consideration these types of structures and word choiceage from people who may have grown up in one place, in one language variety, and moved somewhere else. And then it gets a lot more complex. But that is something else I do, is I do look at people who are operating in an additional language that they learned later, and look at also what would the norms be in their first language, and look at kind of what might be going on there, if there's some sort of overlap of features, or if something else is going on. So it gets very multi-leveled in the analysis.
I can imagine. But it's interesting also that you actually use it as an information, I guess, a source to base your analysis.
Because it's important. We never drop any features of, we might think we do, but we don't, any of the subconscious features of the way we speak, and of the other languages we've learned, and of the additional ones we pick up, and places we've lived. That all becomes part of our linguistic repertoire. So it's all pieces of the puzzle.
What was your most interesting, curious I'm curious. I'm just curious. Ask me this stuff. The most interesting piece, or like, as in format of type of writing or language, not only writing but language, that you actually ever analyzed.
That's
Because it can be a
tricky.
variety, right?
There's so many interesting ones. I mean, one of my favorite things to look at has even more of a crossover with psychology, which is looking at the reliability of testimony, ear witness testimony. When
Right.
someone says, I heard this person say this, they sounded like this, they did this, I can identify them because they sound like this. I didn't see their face, but they sound like this, and then looking at that and seeing how reliable that is, or what sort of other real world things they're drawing upon. That area of inquiry fascinates me. And I've done quite a bit of research in that area as well, and worked a number of cases in that. But that's interesting too, because then, you get the transcripts, but you also get the interviews with people, and it's really interesting. There are markers in discourse as well that we can look at when people are trying to reconstruct mentally what happened. And so chasing those markers and seeing what they correspond with to see at what times they're trying to piece back together things that happened. And those are also times when their memory is most likely not as accurate.
And how do you see that then? What are these markers?
Good questions. Yeah. So some of the markers have to do with restarts in the language, the amount of times you restart and stop and hesitate and then start again. Those are things we do naturally when we're talking. People do it different ways. Some people do it by some people do it just by restarting the word or sentence again. Some people do it by cutting themselves off and stopping with silence and then continuing on. But all of these are hesitancies that show they're thinking through, trying to piece through those bits together.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
So fascinating. So if somebody has read all your papers and all these books, would they then be able to get away with deception?
No. That is one thing I worry about. So I am very careful about how much detail I share specifically, because I always do consider that, having done my training in Washington, D.C., I do have that always. I'm concerned with that. So but no, unfortunately, they might have an idea of how to do a very rudimentary analysis, but they're not going to be able to cover themselves up, because there are also things so under the radar that there's no way you can't, no matter how much you practice, you just can't.
Yeah.
So
that's so funny, because it's in the faking area of psychology, or also psychopathy, that's is also a question, and it's quite interesting that people try to fake to be high or low on psychopathy. So they just overshoot. So if you ask people to do that, they just overshoot completely, and this is just so out of question that it's not actually an area of concern.
And I totally understand that, and that's why we compare across a set of documents or recordings or whatever, because you can see a person's natural variation, and then you can also see when suddenly something's way off the scale because something else is going on, like they're trying to make you think they're doing or thinking something else.
It's always interesting how we think it's so easy to fake something, but it's actually not.
There are some great classic examples of that too, where people have, for example, William Labov, a very well-known sociolinguistic variationist in Pennsylvania. He worked on some cases in the past for the US government, and one of them was a kidnapping case where the ransom letter spelled all these very simple words wrong, but then spelled extremely complicated words correctly. And it turned out, the person, they found him, and he was a doctor, and he was trying to downplay his intelligence level. But again, there are things that you're so used to in your everyday, you don't even think that they can then give away who you are.
You know what? What just occurred to me, what would be such a cool collaboration. So when, as I said earlier, so people high in psychopathy, sometimes they they lie for the sake of lying.
Oh,
It's not
yeah.
really to get something. So one of the interesting things that I came across is that people who have committed crimes, and if you interview them, and who are high on psychopathy, there are some cases where they tell you about crimes they have never committed.
That's fascinating.
I think so too. Why would you do that?
Yeah.
So, but it's in the context of research
Yeah.
where it's like and there's no
Yeah.
repercussion. So, but it's more about this making somebody believe something and seeing my reaction as the assessor. So, how does this person react if I tell them about that? It would be so interesting to see if you would look at these statements, if there would be anything that you can take out, if this
That
is
would be
actually
really
true or not.
interesting, because that is where the some of the research has come in saying, people either give way too many details or way too few.
Yeah.
And that would be one of the starting places. And actually, I say there's no to wrap up. So one of the things I would say, if people are keen on checking out how they themselves lie, I always have my students write 2 pieces of text. Right? One where you tell a short story of a paragraph or so long of something that recently happened to you and it's true. And one where you make something up, and put them aside and bring them back out a week later, and then analyze and see, do you give more detail? Do you give less detail? How did your language change? And that will give you an indication of how you lie, what your lying style is.
That's amazing. That's a very cool exercise.
So thank you to everyone. I guess we'll wrap up here.
Thank you as well, Mamihi. And well, if you have any questions, you can contact us both.
Indeed. Thank you.